Is that right, Joseph?
Yeah.
We've got Joseph Thomas Ryder of the University of Bergen, who's currently a PhD candidate at the university. And his thesis looks in detail at the Norse landscape of Skye and the Western Isles. So we're all really looking forward to hearing this. The Viking Age on Skye, artefacts, place names, and landscape. And over to you, Joseph.
Yes. Is my screen shared or?
Not yet.
Oh, I see.
Here we go. That's it. That's perfect.
All right. Great. Thank you everyone for coming tonight. It's quite a pleasure to speak to so many people. I didn't expect to have over 100 people listening to me speak. My name is Joseph Ryder. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Bergen here in Norway. My thesis is on the Viking Age and Late Norse landscapes of Skye and the Western Isles. Tonight, I'm going to be looking at Skye in particular in the Viking Age. And I was quite excited to speak about Skye in particular because there really isn't much Viking Age or Late Norse archaeological artifacts or finds from Skye compared to, say, elsewhere in the Hebrides, such as South Uist, where there's over 20 settlement sites found. And tonight I'm going to speak about Skye. And before I move on, I'd like to just briefly introduce the area because there are many people I know who aren't here, who aren't so oriented with Scottish geography as well as chronology of the Viking Age in Scotland. So the area of study that we are speaking about is in this red box. It is both Skye and including the inner small isles around Skye, as well as the Outer Hebrides. Even though tonight I'm going to be speaking just about Skye, I'm also going to be making references to the Outer Hebrides, such as Lewis, Harris, North Uist, South Uist, and Barra. Those are the major islands in the Western Isles. And to quickly introduce Skye, I know some people here are actually from Skye. It's quite interesting and exciting, but a lot of people around the world do not really know what Skye is. Skye is the second largest island in the Hebrides. It's certainly the most populous, and it has historically been the most populous island in the Hebrides. And it consists of four so-called wings, 4 peninsulas. You can see them here, Slate, Uig. And the island of Skye, it's located not only in the Hebrides, but on a major sea route, and I'm going to discuss that quite a bit, between Scandinavia and Ireland. But for a quick chronology, because early Middle Ages or Viking Age in Scotland is actually quite different than in Scandinavia, at least. Often Scandinavian archaeologists are surprised to hear that there's a Viking Age beyond 995 or 1030 in Scotland. Nevertheless, for a quick chronological overview, for some quick references, there's the late Iron Age or the Pictish Iron Age in Scotland between 400 and 800 AD. Then we have the Viking Age in Scotland, 800 to 1079 AD. So from the first Viking or Norse activity in the region to the establishment of the Kingdom of the Isles in 1079. Then we have the late Norse period, which is the period where it's post-Viking Age, but the Norse are still in power in the Hebrides, from 1079 to 1266 AD, to the Kingdom of the Isles, to the Treaty of Perth. That is after the Norwegian-Scottish War of 1263, in which Scotland regains the Hebrides from the Norwegian crown. Afterwards, you have the early medieval period and the so-called Gaelic Renaissance, so Gaelic culture returns to the region. This is markedly different than Scandinavian chronology, so it's important for me, at least for my Scandinavian listeners, to go over this. So quickly about sorry, there's an echo. I'm hearing some feedback, including myself. I'm not sure if anyone else hears that. I do.
Yes, Joseph, we can hear that. I'm not quite sure where it's coming from. M White, can you mute yourself, please? I can't do it. Thank you.
Yeah, there we go. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Yeah. So for just a quick introduction to the Viking Age expansion, that is, in short, the expansion of Norse speakers from Scandinavia throughout Europe. Around 795, we have the first references to Viking Age activity in the Hebrides and as well as Ireland. The people probably coming from Western Norway. But before I discuss the Viking Age of Skye, I'd like to discuss briefly the pre-Viking Age, the Pictish Iron Age and landscape, well, so-called Pictish. So in the Hebrides, before the Norse arrive, the period is called Late Iron Age, and you have a variety of different, well, you probably have at least one main culture in the Hebrides, or at least that we can see archaeologically, and that's the Picts. It's more complicated than that. There are probably multiple different ethnic groups within the Hebrides, but that's beyond the discussion of this topic. For simplicity's sake, I'll just say the Picts. In the pre-Norse Iron Age landscape, the dwelling sites, they're characterized architecturally by being semi-subterranean. That means dug down about 1 meter to 1.5 meters into the ground. They're single skin. That means the walls are built with one foundation of stone. And for burials, you have long kists of square cairns, which is a hallmark of the Pictish cairns period. You also have some fortifications, or some structures that could be interpreted as fortifications or dwelling sites, monumental dwelling sites, first built around the 1st century AD, such as Island Dunes and Broks, some of which are probably occupied late into the Iron Age. You also, on the basis of the movement and the evidence of Irish monks, you probably have Christianization and monastic communities active in the Hebrides. And in the Hebrides, you have a Celtic language being spoken, or possibly multiple kinds of Celtic languages being spoken. However, at the early 9th century, or before, well, we have a lack of archaeological evidence really on Skye, for instance, of late Iron Age settlement sites. But we do have Pictish symbol stones. So we can see that there is some kind of distinguishable culture active on Skye. These symbol stones are likely areas of central places or places of power. And of course, again, we have some kind of monastic or early Christian communities, evidenced through mostly Christian artwork, stone crosses or carvings, as well as some references from the Irish annals. However, when the Norse arrive, the landscape completely changes. We see an archaeological end to all pre-Norse activity. We see an end to the Iron Age roundhouses. They seem to be abandoned or in disuse by the late 8th century. Instead you get Norse longhouses. So structures that are built similar or almost identical to houses you would see in Scandinavia, especially in Western Norway. There are some complications with that, but I'll get there in a second. You also get the return of furnished pagan burials. At this point, the islands are probably Christianized. I don't think there's been any very late Iron Age burials dated. They likely were being buried without artifacts, but in the Viking Age of the Hebrides, as well as Orkney Shetland, you get a return of rich, furnished pagan burials in the matter of Scandinavian-style burials. You also get, as a result, the return of some kind of paganism, at least Norse paganism. We know that through the burials, but also probably some cultic sites we can infer from place names. We also have evidence of Norse law, that is Norse land ownership, that is through place names as well, such as the Udal on North Uist. as well as assembly sites, so-called thing sites, again through place names, Norse place names, such as thing. So we see the Norse not only imported their architecture and their burial customs, but also their laws. And then we have the Norse language. We have the Norse language because the oldest stratum of place names, that means the oldest datable place names in Skye and the Western Isles, as well as most of northern Scotland, including Orkney, Shetland, is Old Norse. We do have some pre-Norse names, like Skye, which is probably pre-Norse and pre-Celtic, but by and large, the majority or the vast majority of all place names are Old Norse. So this is quite, to speak a bit about the place names first, this is quite an unusual occurrence. We also see, for instance, that the earliest place names are likely topographical. So as in when the Norsemen are traveling through the Hebrides, if they see a bay, they name it Vik, which these days is likely Uig, such as Uig on Skye, Uig on Lewis. And we also see names such as Bolstadar, which is also found in Scandinavia, which designates a secondary settlement site. That is, there's one settlement site, and then afterwards there's a secondary movement in somewhere in the landscape. Usually some kind of craft or specific task this settlement site will be given, such as quarrying or fishing. We see that in the Hebrides. We also see Gerard, which Richard Cox has said that it comes from a site that wasn't settled, but then was settled and cultivated. So we see now multiple generations, likely, of these names, these Old Norse place names. Interestingly enough, this has been a subject of contention within the last 40, 50 years of scholarship, because this replacement of the place names from Celtic place names to Norse without nearly any trace of the pre-existing names is something unprecedented within, really, I can't think of any other examples. If someone has an example of this happening, I would like to hear it. But for example, in England, when the Anglo-Saxons colonized England or come to England, they retained a lot of Roman place names. When the Romans go to England, they retain a lot of Celtic place names. In North America, the colonists retained a lot of Native American place names. But for some reason in Skye and the Western Isles, well, some reason we have some ideas, the entirety of the pre-Norse place names have been replaced by Norse. It was as if it was a virgin landscape being named. This has led to certain theories about what happened to the people there before the Norse, the Picts and also Kingdom of Daretia, the Gaels or Irish monks. What happened? Well, there are some scholars who argue for the so-called war school, argue that this is an act of genocide or ethnic cleansing, in that there's only one explanation of a total replacement of place names. It's complete and swift ethnic cleansing. On the other hand, there are others that argue, well, it probably wasn't very peaceful, but you might have had complicated process of assimilation, hybridization, or acculturation of the Picts into all the non-Norse into Norse society. But what does the archaeological record say about this? Well, we have some interesting developments in the Hebrides. One is the presence of Norse pottery. It should be noted that Norse pottery in Scandinavia is quite rare. Norway is aceramic from before the Viking Age until the 16th century. In places where there is pottery, it seems that they're being created by people who are Norse. For example, at Koppang in Norway, the pottery seems to be Frisian, Frankish, Slavic. But in the Hebrides, we have a distinct pottery tradition, whereas we have pottery that we actually can use it to date sites in the Norse period, particularly on South and North Uist and Lewis. We also have, however, in Norway, of course, steatite or soapstone is the preferred stone or material for vessels. But in the Western Isles and Skye, in the Hebrides in general, pottery is prevalent. And this has led to some scholars such as Judith Yesh to suggest that the Hebrides had its own distinct cultural identity in the Viking Age and late Norse periods. Others have argued that this is evidence of some kind of cultural continuation, or at least non-Norse substratum of people producing pottery. Now we have longhouses, we don't have that many longhouses, but of what we have some interesting developments. For instance, at Bornish on South Uist, we have a Viking Age and Late Norse elite site. And the second and subsequent longhouses on the site are so-called Hebridean longhouses. They were coined that because the excavators, Neil Sharples, noticed that, well, the foundation of these houses, they're dug 1 meter to 1.5 meters down below the ground, and the walls are single-skinned. This suggests to some, such as Neil Sharples, that perhaps this is a cultural continuation of meeting between pre-Norse Iron Age architecture and Norse architecture. We also have quite a lot. We have many pagan burial sites in the Hebrides. We have about, in my corpus of data, about 12. I would argue is definitely a Viking Age burial. But we do have some interesting developments with this in terms of a high amount of the reuse of pre-Norse funerary monuments for Viking Age burials. For example, this is from Kildonan on Egg. And here we have a likely Neolithic chamber cairn that was reused as a Viking Age burial. Also in the area, we have a likely early Christian, pre-Norse Christian site, and where we have this wonderful silver-plated sword hilt found near about 50 meters away from the Christian site. And this has led to some to suggest that, well, maybe we're seeing some kind of assimilation of the Norse into the early centers of power. The other argument, of course, is that, well, the Norse have seized these centers of power. And I'll get that into later in my discussion. And last year, we had an interesting paper by Ryan Foster, who looked at the place names of shealing sites in Skye in the Western Isles. And shealing sites, for those who don't know, that's a site used for pasturing animals over the summer. The shealing comes from the Old Norse word. The system is in existence in the British Isles. It was until the 1950s and 60s in some places in Lewis or Ireland. It was likely brought over. The system was probably brought over by the Norse, by the Vikings in the early Viking Age. And in the landscape, we have two distinct place names for these settlement sites. The first is Sæter, and that is directly from the Old Norse word for shealing, and the second is Argi. Argi is an Old Norse word, but it's one of the rare words that seems to be a Gaelic word that entered Old Norse. Foster looking at these place names, and Foster has argued that Sæter designates some kind of cattle farm, while Argi designates some kind of milk pasturing farm, and that the Norse likely were either ran into these pre-Norse shealing sites where they had a lot of dairy farming, or they imported people such as Gaels, or used the natives as dairy farmers. It's a very simplistic way of putting his arguments, but that's the gist of it, I believe. What do we have for Skye? Well, as I said, there isn't, in terms of archaeological material, there isn't too much compared to the rest of the Hebrides. Well, not the rest of the Hebrides, particularly from South Uist. But what we have is quite interesting. For example, we do have, besides archaeology, on Skye, we have, of the place name data today, 86% of the place names are of Old Norse origin. As in, some are Gaelicized, some have been Gaelicized by later Gaelic speakers, but 86% can be seen as Old Norse in origin. This is suggestive of intense colonization of Skye during the Norse period. We do have one high-status burial excavated by Lethbridge in around 1920. There are likely more Viking Age burials. I argue for 2 additional Viking Age burials in my corpus on the basis of artifacts. I will do that soon. there also was at least one Viking Age burial excavated in 19th century that wasn't really well recorded, but that's any antiquarian area of antiquarian activity. We have the Store Hoard, a rich silver hoard. We have Dunbeg, which is a Brock site that does seem to have a Viking Age component and late Norse component. Multiple stray finds. We have the so-called Viking Canal. I say so-called because the dating is actually late Norse. It's post 12th century about, even though it's called Viking Canal in the media, and it probably is Viking in origin. Archaeologically, we can't really say. It's Norse. I'll get to that in a minute. And we also have later literary references, such as in the Chronicle of the Isle of Man from the 13th century, as well as the sagas. And they do mention, for example, the Sheriff of Skye, suggesting some kind of importance or lawman on Skye. And we also have references to the Bishopry of the Isles, which was located at Skeabost on Skye. So we know that Skye was likely intensely colonized, had high status burials, and we also know that in the late Norse period, at least, it seems to be one of a place of importance in the Hebrides. But what do we have archaeologically? Well, the first I would like to speak about is Tot on Skye. This is it's a Bronze Age cairn that was reused in the Viking Age. From a placing perspective, we have the name Tot. It comes from the Old Norse word for ruins. This means that it's probably some kind of topographical early place name, because if you have ruins, it's abandonment, and the Norse probably labeled it ruins, very simply. And it was used, this cairn in particular was used as a Viking Age cremation burial. This is, to my knowledge, the only cremation burial we have in my area of study. Cremation burials are quite rare in Scotland. One theory is because, well, the Hebrides are largely treeless. You need to import lumber, need a lot of lumber to burn a body. Therefore, just from this alone, we can infer that this is a high-status burial. From a landscape, we can see that Tot is located on a natural sheltered harbor. It's in an area of high quality agricultural potential. Skye in the Hebrides in general, the agricultural potential isn't as high as elsewhere in Scotland, such as southeast Scotland, but Skye does seem to have at least a higher amount of soil that's better for crops. Historically, the area seems to be a center of power. As I said, you have the island of Skeabost, which is here, where you have, in historical references, the Bishopry of the Isles in later Norse period. You have a picture standing stone in the area, which designates the area as a probable place of importance or power in the pre-Norse period. Also, interesting enough, you have the place name Hinnesdal, which Alexander Sandmark has argued that it comes from the Old Norse word for thing or assembly site. So in the area somewhere, we have a thing site. This is also suggestive that Tot and the area of Skeabost were centers of power, probably from before the Viking Age, through the Viking Age, in the late Norse period and beyond. The artifacts are also of interest because we have some very high status artifacts here. We don't have a sword, but we do have, this is not pictured here, but there were some rivets found. Usually in Scandinavian archaeology, if you find rivets in a burial, it's likely some kind of boat burial. We do have this axe, which is a type E, it's an Irish sea axe, so we're linked to the Irish Sea. And we have a bead of ivory, possibly ivory. The bead is now lost, but if Lethbridge is correct, it's ivory, which means some kind of walrus hunting trade. So again, we probably have at least one center of power here on the basis of one burial. Even though it isn't a lot, with the place names and with the historical center of power, we can see this. I'm actually not sure how I am on time because we started late, but is anyone keeping track of time for me?
No, you're absolutely fine, Joseph. Keep going.
Yeah,
okay.
You're fine.
Yeah.
It's quite long.
Because I don't have the time. Sorry. Yeah. So we also have this. We have a Brock site on Skye, and Brocks seem to have been abandoned, some well before the Viking Age, but the Norse do not the Brochs. In Orkney, Shetland, and in Caithness, there's evidence of Viking Age burials inside the Brochs. They don't seem to be dwelling in the Brochs. However, we do have some evidence of the Viking Age from Dunbeg at Strawn on Skye, and that we have a full Hebridean Norse pot, and we also have some late Norse personal objects and equipment. What I noticed, though, looking at the landscape of Dunbeg, is that, and we have two other Brochs in the Hebrides that have produced Norse pottery, besides Dunbeg, and in all three of the cases, they all seem to have a similar landscape. Dunbeg is located on a natural knoll overlooking a natural sheltered harbour, in between the area of the pasture or the outfield and the area of the agricultural, or the farmland in the infield. And the other two Brochs, Dun Carloway, also produce one tiny sherd of Norse pottery, but still activity, has a very similar landscape. You can see that it's about the same length, about a kilometer to the natural harbour. It's in between the area of farming and pastoral, and occupies a high part of the landscape. And finally, we have a third one. The landscape situation is almost identical. At Dun Carrier at Umbara, we have again a very similar landscape situation. So it seems to me that while the evidence for Norse occupation of Brochs is quite scant, unfortunately, none of the finds were stratified, or at least recorded with modern methods. But it does seem that the Norse are using certain Brochs for if they fit into a certain landscape pattern. And in this Broch, at least, I would argue that James Grant Campbell has argued some of these finds, at least the ring, is late Norse. I've recently heard an opinion by a Viking Age arts expert that this belt buckle is not late Norse, it's actually Viking Age, which means that it's I would argue, a possible burial site that's been disturbed by later activity, likely. Whereas Norse pottery, Alan Lane has argued, is evidence of settlement. What we're looking at here isn't quite clear, but we do see clear use of this Broch in the Viking and late Norse periods. So I would argue that it's quite possible that the abandonment of Brochs in the Hebrides can be called into question. The issue, of course, is that there isn't enough archaeological evidence, and it doesn't seem that the Brochs will be excavated en masse anytime soon. But again, the likelihood is that these Brochs in particular that were used, fit the Norse landscape need. The next item I'd like to discuss is a belt fitting from Aishag on Skye near Broadford. It was found in a rabbit scrape in the 90s in what is now the modern cemetery of Aishag. It's a copper alloy strap-in for a belt, and it is certainly Viking Age. I've been assured that it's 9th to 10th century by an expert in Viking Age art on the basis of the artwork on the present, as you can see on the strap-band. What's interesting, though, is that this strap-band is found throughout, or similar strap-ends, this style of strap-band is found throughout the Irish Sea region, particularly in northwest England as well as in Ireland. It seems to be a Hibernal Norse style artifact. Hibernal Norse is a term used to describe people of mixed Irish and Norse ancestry. And what's interesting, though, is that the site that this belt buckle comes from is also the site of a pre-Norse early Christian center on the basis of an incised cross. The landscape of Aishag is of interest for my argument that I will make in a minute. It's on a natural sheltered harbour, though Broadford is, of course, a better Harford. I'm sorry, my map is a bit messed up here. The place name Aishag is Gaelic for ferry, which is suggestive of at least in the post-Norse Gaelic period, some kind of landing place or harbour. However, to the west, we do have Broadford, which is from the Old Norse Broadfjord. It is likely one of the early topographical names in Skye and the Western Isles. It's also at a historical church site and modern cemetery, I would argue that this is the site of a possible burial. It might be a bit controversial for Scottish archaeologists for me to do that. That's fine, but I argue this on the basis of the landscape. It fits perfectly with the Norse landscape pattern for settlement, Norse Viking period burial. It also, as well as the artifact itself, is usually just found in burial sites. There's also no indication, as far as I can tell, there's a settlement site here. Well, of course, it could be some kind of stray find. I would think that this is unlikely given the landscape situation here. I'd also like to discuss another interesting artifact shown to me by Susan not too long ago. We have an area on slates at Teng, and it is a copper alloy pommel for a sword. This has been dated to the 9th to 10th century. It is certainly similar to a Scandinavian style sword pommel. However, at first I thought okay, I know what this typology this is. I'm not going to typology now. But after discussing this pommel with an expert on Viking Age swords in Norway, I'm led to believe that this type of pommel, while it is Scandinavian culturally, it doesn't fit into the typology that we have. Perhaps if I had a better picture of a sword in person and showed this sort of an expert on sword typology in person, they would give a better answer. But from what it seems like, this is some kind of either copy or some kind of local development. I also believe, I can't actually say where this sword pommel came from exactly because it was found through metal detecting. But it came from the area of Teng or Torbeg. The place name Teng, that comes from Gaelic for tongue, but the bay is called Torbeg, which is from Old Norse Thor's Bay. I was told by a placing specialist, someone who knows placings better than I do, that this is likely a theonym, that is, this is likely a place name dedicated to the god Thor. We know from elsewhere in the Viking world that the place names dedicated to the god Thor were usually of quite high importance. They usually designate sheltered natural harbors, for example, Torshavn in the Faroe Islands today. So we have this, and the landscape of Teng and Torbeg, you have a natural sheltered harbor as well as prime agricultural land, at least prime for Skye. You also have a sword pommel. Usually, it's very rare to find swords, if at all, that aren't in a burial context in the Viking Age. Even though the person who had entered this into the database said that it's probably not from a burial, I must disagree. I think this is absolutely from a burial. It could be a disturbed burial, likely the case. Nevertheless, it's from a burial. It also, if we take in consideration the place name and the pommel alone, this is another site of elite activity and probably a site of great importance in the Viking Age. The landscape, again, as you can see, you have a nice sheltered harbor here. You also have a medieval castle, later medieval castle in the area, Knock Castle, which was the power center of the Clan MacDonalds. So the area is quite strategic, as we can see, in a later period. And even though the find spot probably doesn't configure into a Viking burial pattern, it's still likely a burial site. And as we can see in the greater context, this site on slate lays on one of the major, which I'll get to in a moment, travel routes throughout the Hebrides, that is through the Kyle of Lochlash. I'd like to go back to the idea of it being a local manufacture, though. The issue, of course, is that this find is out of context. It was found by a metal detector. I think that from what I've read, it sounds like this site was already disturbed. However, it to be some kind of either local development or unique pommel. Still Scandinavian. Unfortunately, one article can't really tell you much in the situation. I have nothing else to compare it to. I would argue that it's probably some kind of local manufacture. Manufacture is probably made in the area. What we might be seeing here is some kind of local development and local culture through the archaeological material. Just briefly discuss some other of the archaeological finds on Skye in the Viking Age. We have the hoard of the Store hoard. This was found in, I think, 1890 something, and it consists of hack silver and coins, all silver. Probably designates some kind of bullion currency, as in weighted currency. It's a typical hoard in a sense for the Viking Ages, and it contains this hack silver and these Arabic coins. What's interesting about this site is that it's found in a very strange place. It's found on the slither of land on the water between a very steep hill and the ocean. It's near what is the natural rock formation of the Old Man of Store, a very popular tourist attraction on Skye. And we have some evidence, for example, in Ireland, that by, for instance, John Sheehan, who argues that in Ireland, the hoards seem to be found at borders or boundaries between settlement sites, usually in liminal areas such as bogland or wetlands. It doesn't seem that the area of Store is, the area that comes from it indicates to me at least, possibly some kind of border or boundary. Also, the Viking Canal. Unfortunately, it is not really Viking in the sense that we have no evidence that it is Viking. It's called Viking in the media. It certainly is Norse, well, likely Norse. It represents what the Viking Canal is. It's a man-made canal that links a natural body of water, a loch, inland loch, to the sea. And there was some boat stems found in the loch that were dated to 1100 AD. So post-Viking Age was still Norse. It certainly is from a Norse faring or a Norse vessel. It's not dated to the Viking Age because we have no firm dating. It's very difficult to date these kind of walls and structures. We do have, however, many, many canal systems from Scandinavia. Also recently, we have a paper by Alexander Sandmark and others who argue for a canal system in the Viking Age Orkney. It's quite possible that this is a Viking Age canal, but it does at least show that it's also possibly pre-Viking Age as well. We don't really know, though I think unlikely. This shows that during the Norse period, the Norse import not only their burials and their customs, but also really their entire way of life, it seems. So Skye is located between Orkney, Shetland, and Ireland, in a sense, in the border Viking world. It is right in the Minch. The Minch is this body of water between the Western Isles and Skye. And the Minch is the major sea route of the Hebrides. The western side of the is dangerous to sail, especially southeast. Modern traffic, at least, goes through the Minch and has for a very long time. There's also a second sea route around Skye, and that is if you move down through Raasay and around the Kyle of Loch Lash. What is quite interesting to me is that the last two sites, the site at Ashig and the site at Torsberg or Teng, they both seem to be elite activity occurring on the secondary or coastal sea route. So we probably are looking at some centers of power, I would argue. In the Viking Age, the sea routes were incredibly important. We know from historical sources and also archaeological evidence that the sea routes were controlled by elites. Harbors were controlled by elites. Even though Skye has a great number of harbors compared to, say, South Uist, it still only has so many harbors. The ability to control harbors and sea routes was likely a draw of the elites and elite activity in Skye and the Western Isles, and particularly for Skye, I would argue. If you look at where the centers of high status activity, necessarily burials, this is my interpretation, of course, of two at least sites. But at Tot, we have the cremation burial, and also at Asheg and at Torsberg or Teng, At Totes, we have a more inland situation, in a situation where the site is located far in the coast, almost similar to the fjord system of Norway. But we also have two centers of power, I would argue, on the secondary or the sea route around Kyle of Loklash. Furthermore, we have, I didn't discuss Egg too much, but at Kildonan on Egg, we do have 3 high-sized elites 9th, 10th century Viking Age burials as well. So we probably see some kind of control, at least of the inner sound of Skye. Burials would designate control and ownership of the landscape and of the harbors, as we know from Scandinavia and beyond Scandinavia in the Viking period. We also have, of course, I didn't speak about Portree, Dunvegan, and Uig. These are the 3, like, also centers of power in the Viking Age, likely, on the basis of place names as well as the fact that they are incredibly good harbors. Unfortunately, at Uig, Dunvegan, and Portree, we don't have any Viking Age evidence archaeologically, but I would bet that these were, especially Uig, on the basis of the place name alone, also centers of power, perhaps even more so than the ones I've put in red, but without arguing that as an archaeologist. So Skye is Hebridean context. Well, it likely has rich centers of power on the basis of control of sea routes and, agricultural, agricultural potential. Likely intensely colonized. Despite lack of archaeological evidence, we don't have the same evidence as we do elsewhere in the Hebrides, but we definitely have high-sized burials, which is an indicator of elite control. And I would argue, again, just to sum up, sense of power at Torveg, Tots, Dunvegan, Uig, and Portree. So what do we, I mentioned before the idea of Hyboro Norse and Skye. We do have other burials in Skye and the Western Isles that do show Hyboro Norse influence. These 2 are from Lewis. This is from Kinip on the Isle of Lewis, and this is from Baltos. In both cases, these are female or woman burials, and they are buried with Irish-style belt fittings in this Irish-style brooch, or Hyboro Norse. In the later period, according to the the Isle of Man Chronicle, we do have the Kingdom of the Isles under control of 2 different dynasties in the late Norse period. One is by the Crovan dynasty, which has a Hyboro Norse origin, it's been argued, and the other is a Summerland or more Regalo-Norse origin. There's a lot of debate about where and when the Norse colonized the Hebrides, as in was the colonization of the Hebrides more intense in the north than the south on the basis of place names. Nevertheless, it is possible, this is just really speculation on my part, that these Hyboro Norse dynasties, on the basis of these burials, possibly were active during the Viking Age before the formal establishment of the Crovan dynasty. Possibly. It's nothing I would bet my life on. I mentioned earlier about the Picts, or the pre-Norse peoples. So one of my main research questions in my thesis is that what happens to the Picts, or the pre-Norse population of Skye and Western Isles? Despite recent publications, for example, from Bornesh on South Uist, there probably isn't enough archaeological evidence for a firm interpretation. Especially on Skye, where the archaeological evidence isn't that full. However, we do have some interesting DNA evidence, new DNA evidence from Orkney, which shows that 2 individuals from Orkney were buried with full pagan Viking Age artifacts in regula, in a very Viking pagan manner. But DNA shows that they were not of Norse descent, they were of local Orkney descent. We have a similar situation in Ireland, where there are, I believe, 2 burials where they are Viking burials, as we can call them, but they are genetically Irish. We have nothing like this from the Hebrides. We don't have any, sorry, from Skye, obviously. We don't have any bodies from Skye. Well, the Viking Age bodies. But we're probably looking at a situation that's where the ethnic situation is quite complex. I don't think it was peaceful. I don't think the Norse were gentle with the conquered. I do think that there was some degree of colonization and in the modern sense of the word. But we also have to keep in mind that there were probably more nuanced patterns that occurred here. Oops. My last point is going to be about the implications of the colonization of Skye. So who migrated to Skye? Well, we know from genetic evidence from the Western Isles that it was likely people from Western Norway. I've heard argument from a colleague and friend of mine that he believes that it was mostly from northern Norway, but that's a different story. Nevertheless, in the Viking Age, Alan McNevin, for instance, has argued that on Isla, it was likely the elites first who were migrating. The reason, of course, is the simple cost of travel and the ability to travel, the ability to fund a journey, the ability to get up and leave and take your possessions. That was likely the elites, at least first. Probably dispossessed elites, landless elites, or elites who would like to have, who sought land. The same with Greenland, where it's been argued, and usually they would take the best land for themselves, and then later the people on the lower end of the hierarchy would begin to come over. And of course, this was probably more complex than I'm saying it now. There probably were always unfree slaves coming with the elites, etc. But by and large, it was probably some kind of elite migration. So we see that Skye was intensely colonized. Again, this is mostly from Pleistocene data, which is not archaeological data, but again, it shows intense colonization. There probably was a broad Hebridean culture in terms of there is the presence of Hebridean pottery on Skye, even though it's one pot. We do have elite settlement sites from both from Pleistocene data and from the burial sites, I believe. We have possible Highland Norse influence and maybe local developments. However, I must stress that Norse culture was still dominant. And this goes throughout the Hebrides as well. Even if we have non-Norse inflections in the culture, there's been an idea in the media lately calling the Norse multicultural or some kind of... No, the Norse were quite conservative with their culture, and any change you see is significant in that. And you see this in the Hebrides. The landscape was completely renamed, all Old Norse names, and you do have some evidence. I would argue, I've been criticized by my supervisor, Neil Sharples, on this one, but I would argue that Skye probably experienced earlier colonization than the rest of the Hebrides. The reason is Skye is a better draw than the rest of the Hebrides. It has more natural sheltered harbors. It has better agricultural land and potential. It's much easier to settle. Unfortunately, without archaeological excavation, this is not something I can argue with, from a moral perspective as an archaeologist. The place name scholars may be able to answer this question better than I could. Nevertheless, more data is needed. However, if we think about, I didn't want to go into too much about why the Viking Age may have happened, but for me, at least, that's been a discussion, of course, for over 100 years now. But I want to discuss, well, the Viking Age, not just as why are people leaving Scandinavia, but why are people going to why are they colonizing outside of Scandinavia? Why was Skye colonized? Why was it a pull factor for migration? I would argue that, well, it has prime arable land, at least compared to the rest of the Hebrides, manageable land at least. It has, again, sheltered harbors located on 2 major sea routes. So it was likely in the interest of elites to control these sea routes, to control the flow of people. And it probably had relative stability, which means that you have likely a quick and swift disappearance of the Picts. Whether I mean physically or culturally, it was likely quick because it shows that there was stability within the Hebrides. It doesn't seem that the Norse have this sense of danger either from the non-Norse or the Norse themselves. Also, you can argue that the elites were able to establish themselves centers of power in the same regard as they would in Scandinavia, controlling sea routes and harbors. If I had time, I just want to go over quickly some of my own little research I did on Skye, if anyone was interested.
Please carry on. Yeah.
Yes. There's a site called Arnon Eirik on Uig on Skye, and it was first discovered or surveyed in 1990 as a possible Viking Age house and harbour. What you look at now on the screen is the foundation of a house. When I showed this to my Norwegian supervisor, she said this looks like a Viking Age longhouse with a boat burial. When I show Scottish archaeologists, they say, well, it looks like a black house, as a 19th, 20th century house with a kelp kiln next to it. I am of the later opinion, but though I did want to at least try to see if I could get more data or a better interpretation of the site. So I did some photogrammetry at this site, as with others in the Hebrides, using a drone, and I created a 3D model, which didn't show me too much that I didn't know already. However, if you look at just below the ground, it's not too good on my screen, but you can see it much better on my screen at least. It's an impression of an earlier structure, boat-shaped structure. It could be Viking Age. This also could be Viking Age. We don't really know. It hasn't been excavated. It could be a Viking Age house located underneath, next to maybe a modern house, maybe not, or maybe it could be medieval. So it's possibly the site of future research. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. That was brilliant.
Oh, thank you.
There's a wee bit of an echo here. I don't know if that's just from you or if it's from anyone else. So we've actually had a lot of questions coming in there. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to start at the beginning and go through them in order. So brace yourself. See how you can answer these.
Sure.
The first one we have is from. Oh,
sorry,
you can stop
screen?
sharing if you want to. Yeah, it might be that you want to go back to a particular slide, but we can deal with that as it comes. So
okay,
if you want to stop sharing, then we can see you better anyway. So it's up to you. The first question is from Susan, and it says, we've interesting longhouses on the Western Isles, but not on Skye. Why do you think this is? Where are the Skye houses?
Well, I think that Skye houses are probably underneath modern houses and underneath the modern 19th, 20th century settlement sites. In Norway, for instance, in Western Norway in particular, longhouses are also quite rare. And that is mostly due to the idea that they're underneath modern houses. I also think that it's a matter of surveying and coastal stability. We have the houses of Drimmoor and Kilfedar and Bornesh, so 3 sites on South Lewis, and we have two longhouses on Lewis, Bostad and Barbas. With the exception of Drimmoor, in all these cases, these sites were threatened by coastal erosion, rabbiting, wind damage. I think it's mostly a matter of recovery and surveying, but I think it's also a matter of most of the sites are going to be underneath modern houses, or they're also possibly misidentified as black houses.
Okay, thank you. Susan, did you have anything to add to that? Are you happy with the answer at the moment? Okie dokie. Right, the next question, Joseph, we have from Mal Nicholson. Is there any indication of Viking-type boat burials? I don't know if that's on Skye or possibly just on Skye. Mal, if you've got any more specific questions to that, then please jump in. But I'm assuming Skye.
Well, for Skye, there's the tote burial, I would argue, is a boat burial on the basis of the rivet. It is one single rivet, but at least according to Scandinavian methodology, usually if you have a single rivet, a boat rivet, in a boat burial, is considered to be a boat burial. I would argue that tote is a boat burial. If it was excavated, unfortunately, before our modern techniques, so we don't really know. But in terms of the Hebrides or Western Scotland, we do have at least one boat burial from Otternesh on North Uist that was excavated by Skye Beveridge in, I think, the early 20th century. it wasn't well recorded. I don't even think the artifacts were cataloged in any museum. But according to his notes, or his publication actually, it does seem to be a boat burial, as well as there's probably a second and third boat burial in the area. Beveridge also apparently excavated a boat burial on the Isle of Valais on North Uist as well, including there is a spear point in the National Museum of Scotland, which certainly comes from a burial on Valais. Whether or not it's that burial that was mentioned by a local, actually, I don't think it was mentioned by Beveridge. I do believe that there are more boat burials. There are some possible boat burials on South Uist, according to Neil Sharples, near Bornesh. But this is possible. Unfortunately, with this, it could quite possibly be something very modern as well. But there is the definite boat burial at Armagnac. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but on the peninsula just south of Skye, on the mainland, there's a boat burial that was excavated, I think, in 2010, which the publication is freely available. If you're interested, I can send it to you.
Yeah, we'd certainly love to see it. Hopefully that answered your question, Mal. I'm going to take one more question from the chat, and then we have someone with their hand up. So the next question is from Duncan Kennedy, and it says, there's a lot of place name evidence of Norse settlement across various parts of Scotland, like the Western Isles, Skye and Rossiter, without the amount of archaeological evidence that might be expected by the saturation of Norse settlement or control. Have you got any thoughts about that? So there's a lot of place name evidence, but little archaeological evidence.
Well, that is the case for Skye as well. It's 86% of the Skye's place names are Old Norse, of Old Norse origin. In comparison, South Uist, 30% of surviving place names of Old Norse origin, yet South Uist has about 24 plus Norse settlement sites. I think it's a matter of data recovery. That would be my opinion. It's also quite possible that there are some arguments about in scholarship about theories about the Norse being landlords. In other words, the Norse show up, they take control of the existing landscape and population, they rename the population, and they take resources from them, almost in the pseudo or proto feudal system, but they don't dwell much in the landscape themselves. I think that's, at least from what I've seen, I don't believe that's the case. I do think that where you see a high amount of Norse place names, you have a high amount of Norse settlement sites, and that would be a matter of data recovery. But it could also be that it differs from place to place. Orkney, Shetland, certainly there was a high density of Norse settlement sites, archaeologically and place names. In the Hebrides, it varies. So we could be seeing a different developments that occurred. But I think that unfortunately the data isn't good enough to say one way or the other at this point.
That's great, thank you. I'm just going to pass over to my colleague Ian, who is looking at the hands that are coming up. Ian, have you got any hands coming in? I for some reason I can't see them tonight. So if you've got any hands coming up, then please direct them to ask the question.
Yes, there is. I think Ryan Foster has a hand up, but I can't get to him in the attendees. I don't know whether Ryan would like to ask his question in person.
Yeah, hello. Thank you, Joseph, for a lovely talk. It was really, really enjoyable talk.
Thank you.
I was just going to point out, you were saying about the possible dense Norse settlement across the Hebrides. If you've read Alan McNiven's book on Islay to the south, it's one of the arguments he makes that later Gallicization has wiped out a lot of the Norse place names, but it does seem to show quite a dense Norse settlement in the Viking Age. Could you get that?
I didn't get the last part. I'm sorry.
No, just saying that Alan McNiven's work on the place names in Islay would seem to corroborate what you said about the sort of dense Norse population during the Viking Age.
Oh yes, so thank you. Yes, and thank you for. I'm sorry if I butchered your arguments.
No, you didn't.
It's a bit strange actually speaking to a screen, so I lost my train of thought sometimes. But I've read his book. I probably reiterated some of what he said unknowingly, but I do think that I know he's of the opinion that the discrepancy between North and the South is on the basis of the re-Gallicization of the Hebrides and the intensity of it move, or at least in the south, being more intense in the south than in the north. I think that's probably what the data we have shows. I do think that it's interesting that entertainment thought that, well, geographically, Skye and Lewis and Harris, which have 86% surviving place names in Old Norse, may have experienced a longer period of Norse colonization and a longer period of Norse cultural domination, and that might have been spurred on by an earlier or more intense population in the early Viking Age. But I think that we're lacking the archaeological data that we need to compare to, say, Bornesh on South Uist, for example.
Thank you very
Hopefully
much.
that answered. Yep. Thank you. I have one more hand up at the moment, and then we'll go back to the chat. So, Elizabeth Hall, do you want to ask your question directly?
Yes, hi, I would. My other button isn't working. So I'm wondering about one of the pictures you posted at the beginning. It reminded me of some of the finds on Bosta Beach, on Great Bernera, on the Isle of Lewis. And I think there's an Iron Age settlement there that they've, found and made a recreation, and some Viking thing also in it. We found rivets and things like that there, just laying around. So I was wondering if you could say anything about that area.
Well, yeah, Bosta is definitely a site that I've looked into a lot. It also has a Norse the Iron Age settlement site has at least one settlement site. The houses has a Norse longhouse built on top, and there was a surviving corner of the house. What's interesting about this house, even though it was just a corner, it seems to be made entirely of turf and stone, rather than just stone, as in the houses later at Bornesh. It also seems to be not semi-subterranean, I believe. It's hard to say because the site is unpublished. There's also a lot of Norse pottery recovered there. Was recovered there before the Iron Age site was found and after, as well as soapstone sherds. There's been at least one PhD that looks at the fossil evidence of Bosta from both the Iron Age and the Viking Age. I'm not sure if you're aware of that, but it seems to also be that it was a site of deer antler processing. And we do have this place named Bosta, which is from Bostadar, which is suggestive of a secondary settlement site. When I was there, I've heard that from the person working at the museum that the late Iron Age artifacts were an indicator of quick abandonment. And it's also a period of, at Bosta, after the late Iron Age abandonment, which I think is around the late 8th century, there's a period of squatting, so-called squatting. So the site's abandoned, and then someone's living in it afterwards, between the Norse house and the late Iron Age house. Well, what that is, we don't really know. We can, of course, like to speculate that it is Norse waiting to build the Norse longhouse. That's, of course, just pure speculation and fantasy without more evidence, but it's quite a possibility. I would argue that Bosta, despite the place name, was probably an early settlement site of the Viking Age, on the basis of that it does earlier than as early as in mid-9th century. I should mention that there's a lot of chronological problems with dating longhouses in the Viking Age and Hebrides, but on the basis that it does occur on the beach, right at the natural harbor, we do see a lot of evidence of Viking Age elite burials around Loch Roag, like Knip and Valtos, for instance, Knip Cemetery. And we have quite a few North settlement mounds on Lewis, northwestern Lewis as well. So the area is definitely an area of interest for me. Thank you for bringing it up, of course. I'm sorry if I spoke a bit too much about it.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. That was great. I've got two questions here. We've actually got a lot of questions coming in chat, so I'm going to try and plough through them. I'm going to group two of these together, and this one might be outside your area of expertise. So Joseph, I don't know what you're thinking. We have a question about Argyll and also about on the mainland opposite Skye, like Applecross. Would the pattern of Norse settlement be similar to Skye or different? You know, what do you think, despite so much less evidence in Argyll, how strong was the Norse community there in these kind of areas out with Skye?
To be honest, I haven't looked at Argyll or the mainland of Scotland too much, because I had to limit my area of study to at least one box and not to get overwhelmed with the data. But I imagine Argyll will be similar to Islay, where you have a high amount of probably evidence of place names, not too much archaeological evidence. On the mainland, I know there's at least on the mainland of Western Scotland, right on Armagnac Peninsula. Yeah, that wrong? As I mentioned before, there is a boat burial, which is quite important for the area, for the Viking Age in Scotland. You do have a possible burial as well on the mainland near Skye, but I don't think the level of surveying or the level of research has been nearly enough, as much as, say, the Outer Hebrides. So I really can't answer this further, but thank you for the question.
Okay, so that's one for the future. So if either of, who was that? That was Jill or Alan Gillings, you want to take that up as research, then feel free. It doesn't sound like anyone else is taking that on just now. A question from Meryl Marshall. Is there any mention of Skye in the Orkneyinga sagas? Or have you got any comments on the Hakan that gave his name to Kylakin, where he's thought to have had a castle? Have you got any thoughts on that one?
Well, unfortunately, I'm not a historian, so I don't know too much about the sagas. I have read the Orkney saga. I do not remember if Skye is mentioned in particular in the Orkney saga. I don't know if Skye is mentioned at all in the sagas. Usually in the sagas, from what I understand, the islands are called Sudoir, as so the entire Hebrides as a whole is mentioned. As for the other question, I'm sorry, I don't know.
Thank you for that. Meryl, if you had anything to add on that one, then please add it into the chat and we'll have a look at it, or we can pass it on later as well. Now, next question is from Norman Newton. With so many Norse names in Skye, oh, this one. Okay, is there a case for trilingual road signs? Norman, I think you're pulling our leg slightly. Should we allow the Gaels to airbrush 350 years of Norse culture from their narrative story? With tongue in both cheeks. Thank you, Norman. I'm going to pass on to the next one. From Roberta Bailey of Wales, I believe. Has all of Skye been surveyed archaeologically? If not, how much area is left to explore? Have you surveyed every inch of Skye yet, Joseph? If not, why not?
Well, I'd love to, but I actually don't know how much of Skye has been surveyed. I haven't surveyed Skye much. I mostly just looked at sites that were already surveyed in my short visit to the island. I think that would be a question probably for Susan, I would believe, who could answer this better than I could. I don't believe Skye has been surveyed much in the some recent decades.
I'm just going to come back in that. Susan, come in if you want to. I think, yes, parts of it have been surveyed, and certainly I'd say the bulk of it hasn't. And certainly the biggest surveys that have happened of maybe like the first settlers surveys only focused on a specific period like the Mesolithic, so there's plenty of work there to do, I would say. Has anyone else got anything to add at that point? Susan, did you want to come in on that?
I'll just jump in actually. Skye is probably one of the areas when I'm looking at other sites, when I'm putting sites onto the historic environment record, if I'm looking at aerial photographs, I will always find new sites on Skye that haven't been recorded before. So there's huge potential for more to be found. And as Joseph said, there's really the possibility that a lot of Viking settlement lies under current settlement. So anyone digging a hole in their garden for a new greenhouse or a new shed is potentially going to come across something quite interesting in a lot of places, I think.
I would add that also you probably have a lot of activity at Uig and at Portree, two areas of recent urbanization. So, but I would bet my life that there were important Viking Age sites at least at Uig and Portree.
Excellent. Susan, did you want to come in on that? See your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. The Scotland's First Settlers project was actually quite interesting in that it found a lot of rock shelters that had early medieval and medieval occupations. So some of it that spans into this area. There's a whole nother possible focus. At Ashig, we have metalworking going on just outside. So there are lots of hints. These aren't big surveys, but lots of other hints that might bring us a bit closer.
Thank you, Susan. I'm just going to move on to the next question. Again, if anyone has anything to add to that wee discussion, then please just add it into the chat list, and we can always pass it on. I'm just going to mention now actually that Ashig has been mentioned quite a lot with the strap end that you found, Joseph. Next Friday, our talk is focusing specifically on Ashig and what's been found there. So if anyone is wanting to carry on this theme, then please come along next Friday as well and hear that talk. Our next question now. Okay, we've got the reference to the Ardnamurchan boat burial. Thanks, Susan. So from Jill, would LiDAR be useful for Viking surveying? Do you think that has a specific meaning for using LiDAR? Would that help you, Joseph?
Absolutely. I'm eagerly awaiting LiDAR for more of Scotland, especially on Skye, for instance. I know exactly where I would start looking, so yes, absolutely.
Okay. Again, it's a surfeit of data, isn't it? There's a whole life's work in pouring through that data as well when it comes in. So fingers crossed that you're there to look at it when it comes in. I've got an answer to the saga question here. At the very least, Skye is mentioned 3 times in the Hakonar saga, Hakonar Sonar. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing that right. But Meryl, there's a wee in the chat. There's hopefully an answer to your saga question. And moving on to the next question from Talahopper. With lots of new buildings going up on Skye, is archaeological survey part of the planning process? And I think I can answer that one. I don't know if anyone else wants to come in, but yes, it is part of the planning process, Tala. If there's a possibility that we think there's a potential for buried remains to be found, then yes, something will be required of anyone who's building a new house to have a wee look at it there. I mean, in theory, you could argue that it's every single new development in Skye, but we have to justify as much as possible. And certainly for larger scale developments, like wind farms, there's a few of them going in Skye, then they have to have a real close survey and a bit of monitoring as well. So hopefully, you never know what's going to turn up as well. Have we got any more questions coming in? Got one here. Oh, sorry, one I've missed. Would Ullapool and Westeros be from Viking or Gaelic? What do you answer on that one?
You can always ask J.R. Morton, I guess, but sorry.
Okay, we're not sure. We'll leave that one undecided for now. And we've got from Julie Rich, there's no mention of Skye using the Hordor spelling in the Orkneyinga saga. Place name glossary. Penguin edition. Okay, so we're getting into specifics here. I think you guys might have to fight that out amongst yourselves because we need to do a bit more work on that to find out exactly what's in the Orkneyinga saga. So have we got any more questions? Or any more hands up? I'm just having a double check. Ian, can you see anyone else asking a question that I've missed?
No, but Duncan Kennedy's just come in with that Ullapool is a Gaelicization of a Norse place name. So it's originally a Norse place name, but then Gaelic over the top of it. So.
Okay, smashing. Thanks, Duncan, for clearing that up. We'll just see about calling into that. You've got the final word on it. So what I'm going to now is thank you, Joseph, really for that fantastic talk. It's not something we often get to hear about. So we're really pleased you could come tonight. And everyone could come along to hear it. I think we had a maximum of about 150 people, so you were a real draw there, and I appreciate coming along.